as usually said, I've been working for NATO for the last 15 years in various incarnations, but in one way or another, always handling Russia and Ukraine and that part of the world, plus this country, the Czech Republic, which is my fatherland. Indeed, I'm the deputy head of the engagement section, which probably doesn't translate into any other language. I don't know how it sounds in English. In fact, you know, when I first introduced myself to a friend of mine a few years ago, he thought that I was now in marriage counseling, which is not the case. This is really about engaging, you know, people like you, people that we consider important, crucial to have a dialogue about international security, think tankers, journalists, analysts, parliamentarians, you know, people that I think, people that we believe have an impact on how the alliance and its policies are actually perceived in the member countries and in the partner countries. I'll be talking in my presentation for about 25-30 minutes, and then we'll have about an hour for Q&As, because I remember from my own studies, you know, when I was in your age, I remember that the only way not to fall asleep at a lecture was to give it, you know, so I will not abuse that privilege for way too long. And after half an hour, I think we'll delve right into Q&As. The first thing to say that indeed, you know, it's no laughing matter. We are in the middle of, I think, of what I think is the most serious crisis since the end of the Cold War. What we are seeing in the East is actually a concerted effort by a country that until recently had been seen by many as a partner, you know, assaulting the rules-based system, trying to, in fact, a system based on no rules whatsoever, questioning legitimacy of the entire post-Cold War order, and of course we had to react to it as an alliance. But before we actually get into the crisis, let me just say a few words about prehistory of the current crisis. Because if you look at, you know, the NATO-Russia relationship, there has been for the last 25 years efforts, I think, from both sides, and beneficial ones, to engage with each other. I will not go through all these you know, milestones in our relationship, but what I think the pattern that you can make from these various events is that, you know, the pattern was that there was a crisis, a down, but there was an up, you know, effort from both sides actually to come together and try again to start or to at least work in areas where our interests coincide. The values was always a different thing, but where the interest, for example, in fighting international terrorism, nuclear or weapons of mass destruction, proliferation. And indeed, you know, in 1997, we signed so-called Founding Act, whereby we said that we didn't see each other as adversaries. We actually refrained from using force and threat of force in European or in European matters, in European security. We set up a council. Diplomats, wherever there is a problem, always react in the same way. They set up a council, you know, and this is what we did in 1997. The first NATO-Russia Council, it was called Permanent Joint Council back then, was set up. Yet in 1999, we had the first serious crisis in our relationship, you know, over Kosovo. Russia, who actually deployed troops in Bosnia in 1995 alongside NATO, saw things very differently. It, in fact, blocked, or in a way, possibility of NATO having the UN Security Council mandate. It said that if it were submitted for approval, Russia, you know, the country Russia would block it, and therefore it was never actually put to vote. We had basically a 1 year long freeze in our relationship after the Kosovo crisis. Yet again, you know, already before 9/11, there were signs and efforts from both sides to come together, to turn our sights towards the future rather than dwell on the past. And that's and you know, these overtures, if I may say so, were or became much stronger in the aftermath of 9/11, where Russia actually behaved very constructively. President Putin was the first foreign leader actually to call President Bush. You know, Russia was conducting back then military exercises that stopped them immediately. And you know, there were even those in Europe, remember Tony Blair, for example, who was suggesting that nothing short of NATO membership for Russia should be considered. It didn't get that far yet. We didn't get that far in concrete specific discussions about the first reset, if you will. But you know, we came together in Rome in 2002, signed another document called the Rome Declaration, and set up a new council, which was actually the old council with a new name. There were some minor differences, but in principle it was the same. It was the same body, which and the logic was that we would actually conduct our dialogue, or you know, or take our relationship forward at two levels. At the political level, political dialogue, you know, considering and discussing and possibly taking actions in areas of European and global security. That was the sort of political dialogue level, if you will, and at the level of practical cooperation. Yeah? To be honest, the results were mixed. We, I think, achieved quite a lot in terms of practical cooperation. You know, we launched all sorts of joint projects. I will mention some of them later. But there was always a problem with the sort of political dialogue, especially after in the wake of 2003-04 colored revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine, which Russia had the impression that it was something orchestrated by the West, precisely in order to actually get these countries into NATO, which is totally nonsense. If you look at the facts, the argument doesn't hold water. Because in fact, the decision of Ukraine to join NATO preceded, time-wise, preceded the colored revolutions. It was not President Yushchenko who first said that he would like to see Ukraine NATO. No, it was the allegedly pro-Russian President Kuchma who said it in May of 2002. The same thing in Georgia. It was not President Saakashvili after the Rose Revolution. It was President Shevardnadze, you know, who at the Prague summit in 2002 said the same thing, that he would like to see Georgia in NATO. What changed, however, was that these countries that, you know, both Ukraine and Georgia, Ukraine at least initially, seemed to be, you know, pursuing reforms, which would actually ultimately bring them closer to NATO and even into NATO. That was the change. And then from then on, it was clear that again, you know, we are heading for a crisis. 2007, President Putin, Russia rather, made an incredible speech. It's still worth reading at the Munich Security Conference. You know, accusing the West of trying to impose unilateral world. In fact, he compared the United States to the Third Reich, which I think is unbelievable. And you know, and it was clear that things would get worse, which indeed was the case over Georgia. Yet again, you know, there was, I think, we can say now rather illusion after the Georgia crisis that we could come together and again start working in areas where our interests coincide. And that's why we first launched so-called joint threat assessment in 2009, and in 2010 we came together to our third summit really with Russia. Lisbon summit. It was NATO-Russia reset. That's where because the United States launched its own reset in after the with the advent of the Obama administration. NATO had its own reset in 2010. But then again, shortly after the Lisbon summit, which was actually attended by President Medvedev, and let's not make ourselves any illusions. President Medvedev would have never done anything that would not have been blessed by the then Prime Minister Putin. But in fact, it was clear shortly already after the Lisbon summit that again, we do not see eye to eye on many issues, on many crucial issues. For a number of years, we had a rather bizarre debate on missile defense, where Russia, claimed once that it is a threat to its nuclear deterrent. Then it is actually that it's not a threat. The debate that we had actually didn't result into anything tangible, except for Russian decision announced still by President Medvedev to actually take a number of retaliatory measures if the missile defense system goes ahead. But the real crisis came with Ukraine. And I think, again, the Ukraine crisis must be seen as a wider context, because indeed it is not just Russia trying to impose its will on a nation that many Russians still have a difficulty. Many Russian leaders have a difficulty in accepting as a sovereign nation. But it is actually an assault of a rules-based system, on a system where rules matter. Russia has been very, I think, vocal in rejecting the rules that were set with. And by the way, Russia actually participated in many of these, in drafting many of these rules, being it the OSCE documents, being it bilateral treaties with Ukraine, especially the 1997 bilateral treaty on friendship and the later agreement on state border with Ukraine. It actually denied or backed away from its commitments undertaken in the context of NATO-Russia relationship, in particular the Founding Act. It was a clear violation of international law. By the way, the annexation of Crimea was actually, which was based on a farcical referendum, was condemned by the UN General Assembly. Russia for years had been, calling for more multilateral world, but when it actually comes down to it, the UN General Assembly, in its majority, actually approved that particular resolution. And many of these, especially illegal annexation of Crimea and actions and support for separatists in the east, was justified by Moscow by apparent oppression of Russian speakers in those territories, which is totally ridiculous. Russia over the last 25 years had never lodged one single complaint with any international body of treatment of Russian speakers. Russia launched a major propaganda campaign trying to convince the rest of the world that Ukraine is being run by Nazis, which is totally ridiculous. Again, which is one of many lies, of which I will be talking about later. Basically, justifying its illegal actions, its clear violation of international law by blurring the line between facts and fabrication, between truths and lies. Starting with Little Green Men, whose President Putin at the beginning, was claiming that there were no Russian troops involved actually in organizing or in the run-up to the farcical referendum. Then actually a few weeks later admitting it. Then again, releasing all sorts of lies and half-truths. The same go for Donbass, where there is ample evidence of Russian military, involvement both in providing weapons, in training, separatists, in having a direct military presence occasionally on Ukraine's territory. What was NATO response to what Russia did? First of all, full political support for Ukraine. Call on Russia to halt its illegal actions, illegal and illegitimate. One should underline. Then we suspended all practical cooperation. I already said that this was, if there was one thing that actually did work in NATO-Russia relationship, it was the kind of practical projects that we had been conducting since 2002. Just to give you a few examples, NATO and Russia together trained or had a number of projects helping Afghanistan stand on its own feet, training specialists on how to fight drug trafficking, helping the fledgling Afghan Air Force by providing spare parts and technicians training to Afghan technicians, not pilots but technicians. We had transit arrangements with Russia. Russia actually allowed NATO to take military material, non-lethal military material, across Russian territory and airspace from Europe to Afghanistan, which was very useful at a time when the southern distribution network via Pakistan was actually not available. By the way, it was no act of charity on the Russian side, because NATO had to pay for it. And the price tag was significant. It was about 10 times more expensive than going via Pakistan. But nevertheless, there was a willingness to do that. We together developed, one of the areas where we actually did work together quite well was the fight against terrorism. NATO and Russia together developed a system called Standex, whereby you can actually detect explosives in crowded places, such as train stations, airports, all sorts of things. This is now suspended. We together had a number of exercises, actually, believe it or not, in theater missile defense, to protect our forces against short-range and tactical missiles. This is now suspended. We together developed a system called Cooperative Airspace Initiative, whereby NATO and Russia kept each other abreast of civilian traffic, on each other's territory, in case an aircraft is hijacked, and used as a bomb, that the other side is apprised of the event immediately and take action. This is now suspended. We were about actually to launch, after many years, a joint operation in order to rid Syria of its chemical weapons. NATO, Russia, under the auspices of the NATO-Russia Council, were about to start that operation. Providing vessels to transport and destroy Syrian chemical weapons. The operation did go ahead, but without Russia. This was very unfortunate, but we couldn't do otherwise. And by the way, many of these, I would argue that most of these projects were, if not more beneficial to Russia, and then at least as beneficial to Russia as they were to NATO. So for the time being, there is basically no civilian and military cooperation in any respect. We also, as far as the NATO-Russia Council is concerned, it exists, it can meet. It did actually meet twice since the outbreak of the crisis. But honestly, the meetings were not very useful because the Russian representative used the meetings basically to continue with telling things that were very far away from established facts. To talk about fascists running Ukraine 2 days after the presidential elections, where President Poroshenko, who's a centrist, and by the way a Russian speaker, to speak of anti-Russian government running Ukraine was an affront, an insult to common sense. So in principle, and by the way, this is very different from how NATO reacted to the Georgia crisis, where we suspended the NATO-Russia Council, but we continued with practical cooperation projects. The last thing, also, we introduced our own restrictions on the contacts with the Russian mission. Up until the crisis, Russian diplomats accredited to NATO had basically unlimited access to non-restricted parts of NATO headquarters, which, by the way, again, is no way comparable to the kind of access that our people had in Moscow to their counterparts, where at a certain point the foreign ministry actually, not the foreign ministry, the foreign minister was always very helpful, but the defense ministry actually told our military liaison office in Moscow actually not even to call them, which again, defies the common sense. But anyway, as of last April, only the Russian ambassador and his deputy have actually unlimited access to NATO. All others have to ask for permission. What we did vis-à-vis Ukraine, as I already said, political support, full political support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. While there is no military solution, we believe in the political solution. We believe that Russia must stick to its own commitments in the Minsk process, not partially but in full, and to the letter and the spirit of that agreement. In addition, again, to that, we launched a number of initiatives to actually help Ukraine build its own capacity to resist to the armed aggression of Russia and the separatists, or as they call them in Ukraine, terrorists, to resist. That's why we, in fact, NATO launched 5 new trust funds, which is basically a mechanism to help Ukraine build and improve its armed forces, which were left in a terrible state after Yanukovych. President Yanukovych was never really interested in armed forces. He was much more interested in internal forces, which were useful for sort of keeping him in power. But the armed forces were in very bad shape. And with that in mind, NATO and Ukraine launched 5 new trust funds in areas such as logistics, cyber defense, communications, medical rehabilitation. Actually, many soldiers who were wounded in the east are actually treated, at NATO's country's expense. And career transition trust fund to help again, military personnel find new future in the future. And then in addition to that, because there has been a talk, a discussion about the possibility of whether NATO will provide weapons to Ukraine. Well, that is not really an issue because NATO doesn't have weapons as such. It's only individual member countries who have them and who can actually do that. And some already, some do, and each NATO nation actually provide support to Ukraine as they see fit. Some provide, body armor, for example, body armors, like Poland. Others, some of the Baltic countries, night goggles. The kind of equipment that is important for to take up the challenge in the East. One area where, especially where I work, we are trying to help Ukrainians is strategic communications, because Ukraine has been attacked not only in the field, so to speak, but also in terms of propaganda, in terms of its image. Does any of you actually watch Russia Today?
Just to laugh?
Yeah. Well, I have to do it for professional reasons, I have to. But it's incredible. It's incredible what actually you see on Russia Today, and it's not only about. By the way, it's not only about Ukraine. It's also Russia. Despite the name, Russia Today is not about Russia at all. In fact, the channel was showing what was up until 2008, up until the Georgia crisis, was trying to show that Russia was good. That changed in 2008-9. Now the main message of that propaganda bullhorn of Russia is actually to show the West is bad. You would be surprised if you. I'm not telling you to watch it, to start watching it. Really, your time is way too precious to spend it watching Russia Today. But what you see is actually a frontal attack on liberal democracy. And I think that's also behind the decision of Russian leadership, in fact, to attack Ukraine. I will talk about it later. But in that particular area, we are trying to help Ukraine as well. How to actually fight that kind of challenge. Ukraine has been doing remarkably well, but mainly through mainly through volunteers. There has been a plethora of various, NGOs like Stop Fake, Inform Resist, and all that, who are trying to, on a daily basis, to rebut Russian lies. We are trying to help the Ukrainian authorities actually respond to that as well. And as I said, individual nations, provide support as they see fit. In addition to all of that, but ultimately, what we needed to do in response. I've been talking longer than I said. I'll say a few words, and then we'll go to Q&As. We also have to make sure that we need, that we do more for ourselves, because our policy, our approach to Russia over the last, quarter of a century was based on the assumption that ultimately there is an option for both sides to become partners, actually strategic partners. That was the formulation we used in the strategic concept. As this seems to be rather a remote prospect, we have to react to what we see happening in Ukraine, but also the pressure put on other partners, but also on member nations. Look at what happened in Estonia, basically with Russia openly kidnapping intelligence officers from Estonian territory. Look at what is happening with all sorts of subversive propaganda. So in that respect, and again, this needs to be, there is only so much that NATO can do in terms of responding to those challenges. But what we can do is, first of all, two sets of things: reassurance, assure those allies who have every reason to be worried. And if President Putin talks about the necessity of the right and the duty of Russia to defend Russian speakers wherever they are, and we have a number of member countries who have Russian speakers, who, by the way, don't think necessarily want their rights to be defended. We need to respond to that. That's why, in terms of reassurance measures, there's been there have been a lot more exercises, taking place in various, in the Baltic region, but also, for example, the exercise which will take place in Spain and Portugal later this year will have, will try to help that, or is geared towards the same goal. Enhanced presence in those countries. For example, air policing, which NATO has been providing since 2004, since the entry of the Baltic countries and Slovenia, by the way, to NATO. There are now a lot more aircraft providing that kind of protection. Deploying, standing naval forces in the Baltic Sea, but also in the Eastern Mediterranean. That is what we are doing now in sort of, short-term measures. But in terms of long-term adaptation, long-term, perspective, more sort of adaptation or more changes, more, I would say, further-reaching measures are necessary. First of all, revamping and, in fact, creating new structures. In particular, VJTF, which is Very High Readiness Task Force. By the way, all these measures are in strict compliance with the NATO-Russia Founding Act, where we committed not to deploy substantial multinational combat forces on the territory of new member states. And in fact, we are still sticking to that commitment. So VJTF, which is a rotational force, which can be deployed on a 48-hour basis in any area, not only in the along the border with Russia, but something that force is actually already operational with an interim solution for now provided by 3 member nations. But it will be fully operational. Full of operational capability will be declared at the War Summit next year. Hand in hand goes enhanced NATO response force, which was originally much smaller force, up to 13,000 people of troops. Now it is. The plan is to have a force of about 40,000. Another area is, we call them nephews, NATO forces integration units. Basically, small teams, small headquarters actually deployed on territory of Eastern allies, specifically 6 allies, but there are two more requests to actually to do that as well. So again, this is in a way breakthrough, because no such deployment has been. This is the first kind of that kind of deployment since the end of the Cold War. And prepositioning some of the material, some of the assets. Recently, there was an offer which was agreed by the U.S. to station, to deploy some of the assets for the structures that I mentioned, on a long-term basis in the new member I shouldn't say in the new members, because they are no longer new members, but in countries, in Eastern allies. Last few things. This is all very long-term. I don't think that we will see things changed, or that Russia will change its attitude in the near future. Even with the departure of Mr. Putin, which I think was a subject of speculation a few months ago, one would be naive to think that things will change immediately. Russia is a very different country than it was 15 years ago, and I think we need to accept the view and the fact that this is a long haul process. Second, Ukraine, I think, is crucial for the future of Europe. The reason why, I think, the main reason why Russia decided to launch, its campaign against Ukraine was basically the possibility that Ukraine actually might succeed in what it has been, trying unsuccessfully for the last, 25 years or 23 years, that it will ultimately, that it might succeed in creating, a country that would be very different from current Russia. And in fact could become, precisely for the reason or due to the fact that the countries are very close, could become an inspiration. For us, I think it's important to realize that it's not letting Ukraine fail is not an option. But of course, it's not only us. It's also the Ukrainian leadership. And let's be honest, Ukraine has not, didn't have a very lucky hand in choosing its leaders up until recently. Let's be honest about it. And ultimately, the responsibility lies on the Ukrainians themselves. Enlargement, and in particular, as far as Ukraine is concerned, again, it is ultimately up to the Ukrainian people to decide whether they want to be in NATO. The Russian argument that the measures taken in Crimea and further on were motivated by or were based on the assumption that if the process continues, the Maidan, so to speak, the Maidan process continues, that the country would end up in NATO, are bogus again. Prior to the, would you know what was the public support for NATO Ukraine for NATO membership for Ukraine prior to the, let's say in October 2013? Would you know? Take a guess. 13%. You know what it is now? Almost 50. Yeah? This is the highest, even when under Yushchenko up until 2010, when NATO membership was actually one of the sort of stated goals of Ukrainian foreign policy. It never was, the public support never rose above 30%. This is totally unprecedented, and this has nothing to do with what NATO did or what the Ukrainians did. This is a clear consequence of what Russia did. Which is now, and I think rightly so, perceived as a country whose word cannot be trusted. So if you have a bilateral agreement, if you have all sorts of commitments on the Ukrainian, on the Russian side towards, because Russia actually on a number of occasions guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity, but if it has no problem, in fact, backing away from its own commitments, you have to look elsewhere. Support for Eastern partners, again, countries such as Moldova, which has been under a tremendous pressure from Russia lately. We developed specifically for Moldova and other countries, a whole program which is trying to improve their capabilities, something that is very much appreciated. At the same time, however, let's not forget that NATO has 28 members, and each of them have their own perspective. And just as we, in this part of the world, pay a lot of attention to the threat, to the challenge from the east, there is also a problem. There is also a challenge coming from the south. And in fact, the worst kind of scenario would be the alliance, which would be torn into two different directions. The Eastern allies actually focusing more on the threat coming from the east, and the Southern allies and Western allies, trying to convince everyone else that it's the southern threat that matters. I think we need to find the right balance actually to address both, because the worst kind of scenario would be really a NATO torn into two different directions with two different strategic perspectives. And last but not least is that our member nations need to put their money where their mouth is. Last year, well, it's no secret that spending on defense has been declining since the end of the Cold War. In fact, already 15 years ago, and NATO adopted a policy, it was a recommendation back then, to spend at least 2% of GDP on defense, but only a fraction of nations actually do honor that commitment. Therefore, at Wales last year, the Wales summit, the countries again decided, or the countries again agreed to reiterate that commitment, defense investment, we call it defense investment pledge, to spend, at least to reach the 2% threshold, which by the way, 15 years ago was seen as a bare minimum, to reach it within a decade, and at the same time also to spend at least 20% of those 2% on research, development, and new equipment, basically investment. But we are not there yet, quite frankly, and in fact, the figures, the recently released figures, are not that encouraging.